right, and with that, we're going to get started. I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is David Lovato. I am with VTA's Public and Community Outreach assigned to this project, and I'll be helping to facilitate this open forum. As some of you are aware, this is a meeting, not so much a webinar. So what I want to do is for all of you to imagine yourself in this big giant room where we're all facing each other in a big circular table. We all have the same bells and whistles. I do ask that everybody put yourselves on mute unless you are one of the panelists or presenters. When we get to the open forum where we're going to be doing Q&A, each of you will have the opportunity to raise your hand. Oh, you also have the opportunity at any time during this presentation and open forum to type in questions in the chat. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware that this is not a webinar where it's you can't see us, we can't see you. Everybody's on equal footing here because we want that open dialogue and discussion after the presentation portion. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Janice to introduce herself. Janice Soriano, Senior Transportation Planner, who's going to be facilitating this meeting.
That sounds good. Thanks everyone for making the time here. Actually, David, did you want to go through this real quick?
Yeah, that's right.
At least this slide here.
Got it. So quickly, just, you know, I know we got a great crowd that's with us, so I won't go too hard into the etiquette that we do like in public meetings, but we want to make sure that for the sake when we get to the Q&A, if you can rename yourself, if you have that function, if you're logged in either on your smartphone or on your desktop, your first name, last name, and specifically your city. Because I know your organization, your department, your division, your job title, it's not going to fit. I know everyone's really proud of their job titles, but unfortunately it will not fit. It's most important that we know your first name, last name, and the city, because when we get to that Q&A, that's how we're going to identify you. So David from VTA, you know, please ask your question, that kind of thing. You can type in your questions at any time in the comment section. Like I said, please mute yourself during the presentation so we don't get any background feedback. There is a raise hand feature that we'll show you in the next slide. And like I said earlier, this meeting is being recorded so we can distribute to participants later on. Next slide. So those of you that are probably new to Zoom, I can't imagine you are, since this has been our primary form of communication for quite some time. How we want you guys to participate during this open forum is you'll see the control panels at the bottom of your screen if you're either on a smartphone or if you're on a desktop, that there's a chat function. Please utilize that throughout this entire presentation. We have panelists, we have VTA staff who are monitoring the chat so that they can answer the questions right then and there, so you don't have to wait to the end till we get to the Q&A in the open forum section, that we can probably answer questions that you are dying to ask us right here and now, or you can wait and answer that verbally. In the participation button, you'll select that, and at the bottom of the window on your right, you'll see a raised hand. So that's your way of raising your hand so you can verbally ask a question that one of our VTA staff can answer right there on the spot. And now with that, I'm turning it over to Janice Soriano Ramos, who's leading this effort. Janice?
Thanks, David, and thanks again, everyone, for spending some time with us this afternoon to talk about the 2021 service plan and the various land use implications, which is going to be a very unique central topic to the plan today. I did want to mention I am joined here by my other colleagues in VTA planning, who will also talk specifically about these land use implications. So you will shortly be hearing from Rob Swerk, Brent Purse, John Sigabany, and Melissa Cereso, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with in your day-to-day interactions. But I'd like to start off to talk about, generally speaking, the 2021 service plan and what we've got planned for the next year. But before I get into that, I did want to set the stage here and cover VTA's intent around having this more annual transit planning process, because some of you may all remember that we pretty recently launched our 2019 new transit service plan, and this was pretty recently in December, and it was a huge undertaking. It was our first major transit redesign in nearly decades. So although the pandemic unfortunately interrupted the momentum that we've really built in the 3 short months that this was under operation, this is still our intent, starting with this plan, to create these transit plans annually. And in this process, we'll engage more frequently with the community and gather the feedback for every annual plan that we create. So with that said, every year the service planning program cycle more or less will look like this, where we develop a draft plan, we share the draft and discuss it with the community in the summer timeframe, revise that plan based on the feedback we've heard, and then put together a final plan that we then present to the VTA board to then implement this plan in February of the following year. And while this year we haven't strayed too much from this process, we are working a much tighter timeframe than usual, since we've had to encounter a lot of uncertainties related to the pandemic before we even started developing this plan. So there are two main differences here in this process, at least in this year. First, our meetings with the community have primarily been virtual. As you can imagine, everyone's just been in this virtual setting, this new normal here. And second, you'll notice that we've developed 3 plans instead of the one usual plan that we focus our discussion around. And this is to reflect and account for a different levels of service reductions that we've had to consider this time around in response to the pandemic. So getting a little bit into that more, why are we considering 3 plans for 21? And the short of the answer is that, of course, there's several factors related to the pandemic that we have had to consider as we respond to really uncertain financial outlook moving forward. For one, VTA's transit operating budget is largely dependent on sales tax revenues, which certainly took a huge hit in the past several months. And of course, with shelter in place mandates in place since March, we've certainly seen our ridership decline significantly as well. And it's important to note that unfortunately, these challenges are not unique to VTA, and we've been seeing this trend nationwide, particularly with our peer agencies in the Bay Area who are about to go through this very same process that VTA is going with their respective communities and trying to figure out how to manage these service cuts. So that said, the VTA board will ultimately be the ones to decide how much service VTA can provide starting in 2021. And these reductions are certainly difficult to talk about right now, but I should mention that this is the first of many steps and many conversations we're going to have in the future to really make sure that we can gradually recover our transit service over time at a rate that makes sense. So I'm sure many of you have been curious how our ridership has been looking since the pandemic, and it's pretty obvious to state that it's declined significantly the minute shelter-in-place orders took effect in late March. It hit our lowest in April, and if you wanted to get a sense of how this compares to around our August, September timeframe last year, we've certainly seen about 74% less riders than we normally would compared to this time. So of course, this reflects several things. This reflects the fact that there isn't as much travel demand. It also reflects the fact that VTA has had to reduce its service for several, VTA's had to adjust service several times this year, and we are offering less service than we normally would in pre-COVID times. And on top of that, we've faced challenges with carrying as many passengers as we could because we have had to put a cap on our seating capacity on both our bus and light rail. So finally, getting into the 3 plans here, this is an important slide that I normally like to spend quite a bit of time on because it lays out all the different service change themes that we've had to consider for the 3 plans. And just for your reference here, there is this green column on the left that summarizes what our pre-COVID service looks like. And that's just there for your reference. But big picture, this lays out our plan from the best case scenario to worst case. It highlights our service reductions that we've had to consider in red here. And we've had to consider service cuts in areas such as when we end our service, when we would be able to run our service during the midday and the weekday hours as well, or weekend hours as well. And more significantly, we have had to look at how frequently our service would be run, particularly for our frequent routes. And that has been the single most impactful service cut we could consider in all of the plans. And you'll notice here that in the 80 and 70% plan, those 2 plans would majorly be impactful just by having a frequent network that would only run at every 20 minutes instead of our normal 15 minutes that we've got proposed here for our 90 plan. And I'll get into a little more detail about that in later slides. So, of course, these across the board service changes are for sure going to impact our entire community. But in our service planning process, for every service planning process we engage in, we conduct a Title VI service analysis that is meant to provide or protect vulnerable communities from being more impacted than the rest of the population. And since public engagement is a huge component to this analysis isn't conclusive just yet until we wrap up our public engagement. But in our early analysis so far, we've confirmed that none of the plans would cause disparate impact or disproportionate burdens to our minority and low-income communities. To give you an idea of what the rollout of this plan could look like, we did discuss these 3 options that you see here with our board last month, and we had suggested that the plans could play out in one of 3 ways. And although staff were asked to explore these 3 plans, just really to have an illustrative discussion with our community and with the board about this, the good news that we had gleaned from our board workshop is none of our board members seemed really interested in adopting a 70% plan, though we're not totally out of the woods yet on that. But then again, that would leave us to either consider a 80 or a 90% plan. So the 80% plan would be one where we would sustain our 80% service levels compared to normal throughout the entire year, or we could move forward and consider a 90% plan that would be more of a phased gradual approach. And that would give us a chance to monitor travel patterns, look at our ridership much more closely, and remain flexible with any social distancing guidelines that may still apply later on in that year, which hopefully won't be the case. But this, of course, is the ideal plan, as this would leave us with a 20-minute frequent network that we would only have to deal with for just a few short months in 2021. So that is a plan that we're hoping our board would land on. So I had mentioned the frequency of our frequent network is by far the most impactful change we can make. And I highlight here that the 90% plan is the only plan where we're looking to sustain that frequency at every 15 minutes. And the next few slides will really put into perspective how meaningful this is. So here's what our 15-minute network would look like in the 90% plan, which you'll notice preserves all 3 of our light rail lines at every 15 minutes, as well as a majority of our frequent bus routes that you see here in red are also going to stay at 15 minutes, except for just 2 routes that we have proposed to run every 20 minutes in this plan. Here's what our 80% plan would look like as far as the 15-minute frequent network goes. And you'll see that it's a much more severe reduction proposed. The light rail network is no longer seen here because that will run at every 20 minutes. And then the 70% plan, that leaves us with just 3 routes that would run at every 15 minutes in this plan. And lastly, before I hand it off to Rob to talk about the land use implications, there's another impact to take into consideration when we look at what our frequent network would provide. And this is an impact on VTA's ability to connect to BART service. We've learned that BART would likely run at every 15 or 30-minute headways in 2021, so this would make it much more difficult for us in the 80 and the 70% plans to guarantee any sort of timed connections with BART service. Now I'll hand it off to Rob.
Great, thanks Janice. Hi everyone, this is Rob Swerk. I'm a principal planner at VTA, and I'll be talking briefly about the effects of these proposed service plan changes on land use development projects in general. And then I'll turn it over to some of my colleagues to talk about some other aspects like affordable housing and the tie-in to the regional transportation plan. So you are probably aware that there are a number of different state laws relating to land use and housing that reference proximity to transit in their criterion. We list on this slide 2 examples that we can specifically point to. One is the density bonus law updates in 2019, AB 1763, and the other is Senate Bill 743 VMT screening. Both of those laws reference this definition of a major transit stop, which is elsewhere in California law, and it hinges on a 15-minute peak period headway for bus routes. So, if you're looking at, for instance, whether a project can be screened out of VMT analysis or whether a project would qualify for the density bonus law provisions, this question of whether we're at 15-minute peak period headways or 20-minute peak period headways, which would be in the 80 or the 70 plans that Janice discussed, is really key. 2 really quick things to mention here are that there are a lot of nuances. Unfortunately, when these different state laws were developed, they don't all reference the same definitions of frequent transit. Some of them make a distinction between frequent transit on bus, frequency 15 minutes on bus versus on rail. So it's really important to dig into the specifics before you make an interpretation as the lead agency on the land use project. The other thing to mention is that we've heard recently through a great inquiry from Karen Mack, who is assisting a number of cities in Santa Clara County on 743 implementation. We've heard from OPR, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, that it may be acceptable, or it is likely acceptable to consider kind of the long view and say, if we're at only 20-minute service levels for this temporary ramp-up period after COVID-19, that for SB 743 VMT screening, it may be acceptable to look at the long view and say, okay, these projects can still be screened out because they were on 15-minute routes before and they'll likely return to 15-minute routes. So I'll turn it over now to, I think it's Brent, to talk about affordable housing impacts.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brent. I work on the land use team at VTA. We just want to recognize that, all this is coming to some of you at light speed. So we're just really trying to share as much knowledge as we have here to kind of better equip you all. What we know to date in reviewing the guidelines and based on VTA's experience working on ASIC in the past is that for some of these programs you see before you today, ASIC, IIG, TOD, which are all state programs, they all use frequency as a qualifier for those projects. The Strategic Growth Council, which administers ASIC specifically, they've indicated in their draft guidelines released a few weeks ago that projects will be allowed to use pre-COVID ridership and frequency. So that's good for qualifying. It's kind of what we're calling a reprieve, if you will, at least for this round. I did want to note, though, that many of these grant programs have different project categories, and frequency and location does matter. It also changes the type of application you typically apply for. So in ASIC, it's TOD for a high frequency, high quality transit stop definition, and there are other project categories as well. I'm saying this because for future rounds, this may be important when you're considering your housing pipelines, your affordable housing pipelines, taking the network changes into account today. As Rob and Janice have mentioned, we're going to have kind of a ramp up, and we're not exactly sure what this would mean, say, for next round if you're considering projects in any of these project category types. So it's best just to stay in the loop and ask questions and stay involved, and we'll continue to share information that we have. And we're passing it off now to, I believe, John.
Hi, this is John Sagamini with VTA Planning. I'm here to talk just on this slide related to Plan Bay Area 2050. Plan Bay Area 2050 identified updated definitions for the priority development areas. And most important of those was frequent transit service, basically 15-minute headways. Plan Bay Area 2050 used the 2019 Transit Service Plan, in which most PDAs in Santa Clara County met that transit frequency criteria. This slide here basically says there may be a potential impact for future Plan Bay areas. The 90 plan actually has minor impacts if Plan Bay area moves forward, because still most of the PDAs fall within that 15-minute headway criteria. As we get to 80 and 70, frequency would change, and a lot of those locations that had 15-minute transit service would actually have 30 to even more frequency along that thing. So it's still a potential. Plan Bay 2050's land use piece has been approved by their commission, so it does keep intact the priority development area for Santa Clara County. It's just an interesting thing to note that as we move forward to future Plan Bay area, there could be challenges to making that 15-minute headway criteria. And our colleagues at MTC and ABAG, some of which are actually on the call today, are looking at addressing some of those challenges. And if anything comes up between now and the time Plan Bay Area 2050 occurs in relation to the PDAs, I think there'll be a conversation with MTC, ABAG, and all of us here in Santa Clara County. Then I'm going to pass it off over to Melissa for the next slide.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Melissa Cerezo here, Program Manager of the Land Use Transportation Integration Program at VTA Planning. So looking ahead, we were hopeful that this forum serves as a first step in navigating these potential changes, because we do understand that the definition of transit frequency directly relates to land use and development, transportation analysis, affordable housing, regional planning, and so on. And as Janice noted up front, frequent service is core to our mission at VTA, but COVID and economic circumstances have put us, and frankly other transit agencies around this country, in a position to run short-term COVID service. So now we want to transition to a new annual service plan that adjusts to our new operating realities. So with that in mind, we have a few tips and recommendations for you as we move forward and continue engaging in important land use transportation integration work together. First, as you review your development proposals and seek grant opportunities, we recommend planning ahead. So that means paying attention to when your project will be evaluated in relation to our service implementation timeline. So for example, projects being evaluated in the 3 to 6 month timeframe of early to mid 2021, those projects could be impacted. Second, when the 2021 service plan is adopted in December, VTA will issue GIS data showing the locations of 15-minute headway routes for your planning purposes. Third, we look forward to staying in communication to provide ongoing updates to the regional and state programs that we just talked about that rely on 15-minute headways. So changes in transit frequency definitions or temporary relief measures. And we also encourage you to share with us what you learned, just like Karen Mack did. Thank you. Lastly, our land use, long-range planning, and real estate teams are available to consult with you and sort out the nuances related to the various transit definitions and threshold criteria. So with that, I'll turn it over to Janice to discuss community engagement and next steps.
Thank you, Melissa. So as we wrap up here with the next couple of slides, I did want to give an overview of the community engagement strategies that we have underway. Although we just have 2 days left into our community engagement period, throughout the past couple of weeks, we have shared with the group our project webpage, which is a very robust one at that lays out every route change by plan. You can view them by route, and of course, you can also break them down by route according to the city that you're interested in as well. On that webpage, you'll see interactive maps, which are largely what we use to export any of the GIS shape files that you might need for your future consideration, but feel free to take a peek at those interactive maps if that's of any use at this time. We've also hosted several virtual public meetings, 2 VTA hosted ones. So if you'd like a more robust route level sort of presentation from VTA, we do have those recordings up for future reference. And of course, you can contact our customer service team, or any of your constituents can contact our customer service team to provide comment or ask any questions about the plan. What's mainly been central to this public engagement is communicating with community-based organizations and social service agencies, and they've been gracious enough to carve out space for us in their existing virtual meetings so that we can engage one-on-one with riders who would be impacted most by this plan. Next steps to follow up here with, we are wrapping up our public engagement in the next couple of days on the 16th. So that will be our deadline to receive any comments that you'd like to submit on the plans. In November, we are going to move forward with communicating with our committees on what the final plans are. Then that'll follow with a VTA board discussion on the final plans. And then finally, whichever plan the board decides to adopt will be implemented in February 8th of next year. So that concludes our presentation, and I'd like to hand it off to Lola and to David to kick off discussion or any Q&A follow-up that we could answer live here with you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Janice. Hi, everyone. I'm Lola Torney. I'm a transportation planner with VTA. I've been tracking the questions that have been posed so far in the chat. Some of them have also been answered in the chat, but I'll go ahead and repeat in case you've missed that. First off, Tiffany Brown from Morgan Hill did ask if we can have a copy of the presentation emailed to all the attendees, and that answer was yes, we can send that to you. Gloria with Santa Clara asked, will staff make a recommendation to the board regarding one of the options, or just provide the level of service options? Janice, I believe this is for you.
Sure, I can take that on. So as we wrap up and develop these final plans, it is likely that we are going to come out with a staff recommendation on one of the three plans that we've laid out, just in response to what we've heard from the board and certainly from the public as well, that the 70% plan is just completely undesirable on all fronts. So it's great that we've had this candid conversation with the board and the public about what the implications are of the 70% plan, because that has given us a clear indication that we would likely abandon any further evaluation or consideration of that plan. So I'll leave it at that. We will have a staff recommendation on either the 80 or the 90 plan.
Excellent, thank you. A follow-up question to that, also from Gloria from Santa Clara. Thank you for all of those who've adjusted your name, by the way, in Zoom, so we know your full name and also what jurisdiction you're with. Thank you for that. Gloria follows up with, does staff have an idea what option is more likely to be selected? And it's definitely a follow-up to the one you just answered.
I suppose based on our staff recommendation, it is our hope that the 90% plan would be adopted, simply because it does provide more of that flexibility for us to adjust accordingly. So I did give an example that if things were to lighten up come June would be the earliest that we would be able to transition to a 90% plan. And that would more or less mean that our frequent network would run at every 15 minutes. So that could certainly provide us that flexibility and that level of comfort that our frequent network would only run at every 20 minutes for just a short period of time. So I think all signs are pointing that, that is a viable option and a reasonable option to consider.
Great, thank you. Ruth from San Jose asked whether we can consider delaying this decision and what is driving this timeline.
So to answer what's driving this timeline is just to back up here, we had been making these incremental changes to what our service is today because of what the response that's been required of us, right? But because of the pandemic. And typically whenever we make major service changes, we are required to run this through the public and make sure that we have a robust public engagement space for that. But because we were in emergency pandemic levels, we've been able to make those changes without that process. But there's only a certain period of time where we are able to do that. I believe it's a 12-month period where we we would have to consider what our more permanent service levels would be. So, that would put us at February to really having us make what that decision is, like what our more or less permanent network would start to look like. And we chose February because that is what our annual transit service plan cycle typically runs on. We do have 2 other opportunities throughout the year to make more of those minor service changes, but February is really when we adopt more of those major service changes.
Great, thank you. Pew asks, what is considered peak for the purposes of the routes?
So peak hour in VTA's definition is usually around like 6 to 9 in the morning, and then I believe 5 to 8 for the afternoon. It varies route by route, but the frequent network, which typically runs every 15 minutes by our definition, is usually what meets that peak hour criteria. So I hope that answers that question.
I think so. If not, Pew, feel free to follow up in the chat. Thank you. Next was from Wilson in San Jose. What are the criteria by which these plans will be evaluated and considered by the board? And he does follow up, how will equity be accounted into the decision making? But I know in your presentation, Janice, you said no one affected by this will be from low income and minority communities. Can you speak a little bit more to that one, but also what other criteria are these evaluated against?
So is the question, what sort of factors will the board consider to decide between an 80 and a 90% plan?
I believe so, yes. So he may be asking about evaluation criteria specifically, but I don't believe we have any for this. Am I correct?
I would say that is certainly a board discussion. I think what really was the impetus for us developing these several plans was, we were working with the information at the time, and we really want to make sure that we have enough of that flexibility to have a plan to adapt to whatever circumstances arise come February. So I think ultimately it is a board decision on what criteria they want to use to decide between an 80 and a 90% plan. But I would say, our financial outlook is certainly one of the biggest implications. And I don't know if Franklin Wong, who's our deputy director, wants to speak more to that, but I believe he is on the line. Not to put him on the spot, but. Is he?
He is here, yes.
Okay.
I do see him. Franklin, if you're talking, you're still muted. Okay, we might need to come back.
Okay, and there was a second part to that question, right? Around.
Yes, how will equity be accounted into the decision making?
Got it. So with our final plans, we do submit our Title VI analysis. And while we came out with a preliminary report on that, we can't wrap up our Title VI analysis officially until we incorporate our public engagement comments. And so that is certainly a consideration as the board could make as they decide between the plans. But we also, in our service planning process, wanted to apply other elements as we consider equity. So when we looked at where we were making service cuts in our frequent network, we fully acknowledged that there were just a handful of routes that really would not be able to justify having a 20-minute network. So, those several routes were taken into account because of the amount of minority and low-income communities those serve. In addition to that, while we didn't use this so much to sway what we would consider as far as service cuts go, we did look at ridership trends during the pandemic to see if there were any particular routes that had a, more or less, I guess, not as much of a change in how much ridership we were seeing, because that became a clear indicator to us that those were our most heavily used routes, even during the pandemic, where essential workers are primarily depending on those routes. So that was a clear indicator to us as well as we made those plans.
Excellent, thank you. And follow up from Pew with Cupertino. So the peak is not being changed for the purposes of the service plan update?
No.
Perfect. Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you. And that is all that I see from the chat window. If we have anyone else who'd like to ask question verbally, feel free to raise your hand. We can call on you. Or feel free to keep typing it in. That's fine too. There's a lot to absorb here, as was mentioned earlier.
This is Rob. Maybe I'll jump in here with a thought back on Pew's question, the first question about kind of the definition of the peak. I think that a lot of the folks on this meeting or this call know this, but you know, one of the kind of interesting things, it's perhaps both a blessing and a curse, is that the state has often, in some of these laws, the state has left the definition of the peak period and how you actually, assess whether a certain route or a set of routes, meets this criterion, like 15 minutes during the peak. It has left it wide open. In other cases, it's been very prescriptive. So like in the case of that slide that I presented for 743 and for that density bonus law, it's referring to this generalized definition of major transit stop, which in it has, it says just, 15-minute or better frequency during the, I think they might say morning and evening peak periods. No, mention of how long that peak is and so forth, or, do you have to go by the exact 15 minutes, or could it be average frequency? For AHSC, we just talked about this yesterday, there's a definition that literally says between the hours of 7 and 10 a.m. or 6 and 9 a.m., there need to be 12 buses at this location during that period. 12 buses serving that location. So, some of this ends up being, I think, a lead agency interpretation thing, and it may depend on you consulting with your legal counsel or experts.
Great, thank you for clarifying that, Rob. Another question from Pew. What are the budget implications of each of these service plans? Does the board have a target for reduction? Janice, I think this is for you.
I actually would defer that question to Franklin if he's able to speak on this question.
Yes, so hi, Janice. The short answer to the second part of the question is no, the board does not have a target. And I believe that's the reason, our planning colleagues come up with these scenarios to help the board to make a decision. And based on what we have heard last month at the board workshop, our board has extremely little appetite to go for the 70% scenario, which means a 30% reduction from our pre-pandemic service level. And given our current service level at 74%, the other two scenarios happen to be a slight ramp up of what we are currently providing. So I think that's actually where the board would like our planning colleagues to go back and retune, these scenarios. And then as we move forward, we'll have a better sense on where we may end up to be, at least for this fiscal year, for projected revenue to be received. Because as many of you know, that VTA relies on local sales tax revenue as one of our major revenue sources. Together with TDA and STA funding, all these sales tax related fund sources accounted for more than 85% of our revenues. So, basically the economic outlook determines how much revenue that we're going to have available to fund these transit services. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Franklin. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat at this time. If you do have any more questions, you can also feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute.
As people are considering any last minute questions they want to ask, I did want to offer up this forum for discussion as well. If you do have any specific concerns or questions, or if you just wanted to discuss any particular projects that you might be concerned about being impacted by the service plan, then we're certainly happy to have that as well. But I do see a hand raised, so Lola, you can go ahead and take that.
Absolutely. Ruth, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. I think I heard someone ask the question about equity, and you had a slide and I wasn't able to catch it, but I thought what I read was that there was no impact or disparate impact to communities, and I wasn't sure, is that for like Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, or all of the changes that you're proposing?
Ruth, that's a great question. Thanks for that. So when we did this Title VI analysis, we did a separate look at each of the plans. And so in our early findings so far, after we made the service cut tweaks and whatnot, we didn't find that any of the plans would pass that threshold of saying that low-income and minority communities would have more negative impacts compared to the rest of the population. So it's certainly a blanket statement to say that everyone would be impacted by these service plans, but low income and minority communities would not be more impacted than the rest of the population.
I guess just, it seems to me that given the previous comment and explanation of the communities that would be impacted, I guess I'm just curious what that threshold is, because to my mind, it just doesn't seem to make sense that there wouldn't be a disparate impact, like looking at the 70% one. And I suppose that Title VI or, the title you referenced is a federal title, and that's where like those thresholds live. Obviously, I'm sure you've heard this before, anytime, there's a cut, it's gonna, who are the people who are writing, who are the people who are gonna be impacted? To me, I just feel like it seems like maybe not the whole picture is there, but maybe you're going to hear that when you go out to the community and talk to people.
Absolutely. It's not the easiest to capture every impact if you look solely at the Title VI analysis that everyone typically engages in when they do these service plans. But there is another thing that we looked at, which was we also looked very closely at routes that we've defined as our Title VI routes, which are routes that are that serve a high proportion of minority communities. And we made very careful considerations in these particular plans because we found that in those routes alone, that carried nearly 60% of our system-wide ridership. I actually do have a slide that I think would be of interest to this group here, which speaks to that. And so these are what VTA defines as our Title VI routes. And all of these routes, when you look at how much ridership is on these routes, makes up 60% of it. So it's very telling, and we really wanted to make sure that these routes were less impacted compared to the rest of our system. There's always several lenses that we could all collectively be better at applying when we make these service cuts. So I appreciate that comment.
As a follow-up to Kermit with VTA, reminded everyone that some major routes like 22, Route 23, 25, 500, and the 522 would remain at 15 minutes in the 80% plan. Thank you for that reminder, Kermit.
Mm-hmm.
Hi folks, this is Samaya with MTC ABAG. I just wanted to chime in with a verbal comment about sort of the potential impact on Plan Bay Area growth geographies. And just really simply to say that the growth geographies have already been adopted. So there would be no further changes at this juncture based on changes in service levels. It's my understanding from our team at MTC ABAG that the January 2020 is the best representation of future year 2035 frequencies, in case that's helpful context.
Definitely, thank you. Yeah, please feel free to ask any more questions through the chat, or if you want to talk through any scenarios or potential planning impacts, please feel free to raise your hand. We can talk through it.
I'd also probably, this is Melissa Cerezo from VTA, if anyone would be interested in commenting how this information is going to be shared back to your respective jurisdictions, it might be good for us to also understand how that information gets circled back.
Okay, while everyone answers Melissa's question in the chat, I do have a question again from Pew. City of Cupertino, are service levels and routes guaranteed to go back to pre-COVID levels at some point in the future, or could that change in the future?
I could take this on. Thanks for your question, Pew. That is certainly our intent. And it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? I think with our annual service planning process, we do have more of these opportunities to be proactive about how to take this gradual transit service recovery on. And it's hard to tell when it'll happen. It probably won't be in 2022, but who's really to say? But I think if we were set up well for 2021 and we were able to move forward with, you know, this phase 90 plan, I think that would certainly get us there faster. So I hope that provides some level of comfort there.
Might also depend on the sales taxes that we receive too in the future.
True. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed we haven't received any specific questions on affordable housing too, and I know we have some affordable housing partners in attendance as well, so please feel free to jump in.
Okay, we have a question from Joanna from Palo Alto. Just to confirm, school trippers are not affected in any of the plans?
Hi, Joanna. That is correct. When we put these plans together, this didn't factor in anything such as school trippers and special event service. That is something that we will, you know, play it by ear and bring back school trippers as necessary, as we can respond to whatever schools decide to open up in person.
Okay, one more question from Ruth. I have heard that affordable housing developers are concerned about the reduction in high frequency routes as it can impact funding, specifically points on applications, qualification, et cetera. But it sounds like some agencies are considering pre-COVID schedules. Brent, do you want to confirm that?
Yeah, so You know, for project specific, I'm most familiar with ASIC, less familiar with IIG and TOD, although the TOD program guidelines are very similar to ASIC. For ASIC specifically, a project application can use a frequency that was posted by a transit agency in January of 2020. So that's a pre-COVID frequency and ridership, and that can be used for qualification. So a project can still use those numbers, that data, to qualify, say for a TOD project under ASIC guidance. What's interesting about that is that's just for qualification. So many of these programs are seeking to actually change their guidelines to address COVID directly. So a lot of the points and guidelines have also been modified for housing projects and for transit agencies to address service levels of some sort during this COVID time. So the state's kind of giving us direction that they would like us to do different things to help us get back on track, or to potentially restore service, or help out our programs in other ways. So I think that answers your question, Ruth. And I could definitely see, at least to your first part of your question, why there is some concern. It was a concern of ours several weeks ago as these guidelines began to get published, which kind of was actually one of the indicators for why we should have this meeting with you all, to kind of talk about the integration of transit and land use together in the same space, so we can plan together for the future.
Thank you, Brent. A follow-up about school trippers from Tiffany in Morgan Hill. Our school route in Morgan Hill is not running as schools are not yet open. Will that route be up and running again when schools open? Can you confirm what you said earlier, Janice?
Janice, if you want, I can take that.
Sure, yeah, I was just gonna hand it off to Kermit, who's our scheduling supervisor. Thanks, Kermit.
Thanks. Yes, so the Route 87 in Morgan Hill is operating. The basic route is going out to both high schools and right now, but the only one that's not 287, which is the school tripper, like a special trip that operates on school days that kind of goes from Live Oak downtown and then continues to San Martin. The 287 is the only one that's not running, but the regular Route 87 is running the regular schedule. And yes, when school comes back, then we would bring those routes back. You know, they're sort of on hold.
Excellent, thank you, Kermit. Wilson has a question about, has VTA thought about how to rely less on sales tax and maybe create a more resilient financial model for operations and maintenance in the long term? As cities are rethinking their transportation planning policies and development review processes, we can think about, as a county, how to ramp up the operation and maintenance funds besides just focusing on capital funds. I don't know if this is something that we would be able to address in this forum, but definitely something that you're right, more and more folks are thinking of. And Brent is clapping, thank you.
That might be a whole separate meeting. But it's great to point out. It's what our land use and transportation integration team is thinking about every day, and our transit planning team is, you know.
This is Rob. I just thought I'd add a little bit of additional information, you know, since Brent talking about the affordable housing side and the AHSC program, and the fact that the state has actually, you know, in some cases issued clarifications to say, I guess, for instance, that pre-COVID, you know, January 2020 service levels and ridership can be referenced for qualification, for, you know, for eligibility for projects, if I'm not mistaken, Brent. similarly for like the VMT for SB 743, you know, we referenced earlier in the presentation portion, this, I would say it's kind of an informal interpretation that OPR gave in response to a question from Karen Mack on behalf of some of the cities. For one thing, it occurs to me, we can certainly share that email. Maybe when we send out the PowerPoint and, you know, follow-ups from this, we can send that email to everybody that registered here so that you have that. But Chris Ganson from OPR mentioned that OPR is in the process of preparing an update to their technical advisory for 743. And he indicated this will probably be mentioned in that update. So that would be, you know, almost the gold standard if the state actually, you know, puts it in writing formally that, you know, it is okay to rely on either pre-COVID or, you know, to be a little bit more flexible in interpreting this. We actually, after we saw Karen's note, you know, we thought, well, let's give it a shot. And we asked OPR staff if they could weigh in on, for instance, the density bonus law or, you know, other housing or land use laws that reference 15-minute transit service. And we did get a response like, we're thinking about it, but, you know, nothing definitive yet. So that's kind of to Melissa's point earlier in the slide, and it's here too, stay in touch. If any of you hear something, even a somewhat informal read on some of these other laws, please, you know, feed it back to VTA and we can make sure to share that information around.
Awesome, thanks, Rob. Okay, unless I'm missing things, I'm not seeing any more questions. I know we're scheduled to go for another half hour. But if no one has any more questions, either through chat or raising your hand, we can go ahead and end early. I think there was a few more, am I wrong? There were a few more slides, wrap up slides.
Yeah, I could take those on. Okay. Thanks, Lola, and thank you all for, you know, carving the time out to spend the time with us to get more of an understanding of what we're undergoing right now with these changes. And we just want to remind you again, we're here to navigate these potential changes together. We encourage you to plan ahead, think about when your projects are being evaluated. We want you to look forward to the data resources, the GIS layer for the new 2021 service plan that we have, that we will provide in December. And continue to stay in touch with us. We're available here to consult with you. Our teams are ready to provide that consultation. And then some key milestones that are coming up, as Janice noted, our deadline for public comments on the 2021 service plan is October 16th, so that's right around the corner. And in December, VTA board will select the amount of service that we'll move forward with and adopt the final 2021 transit service plan. And then finally, the transit service will begin in February of 2021. Next slide, please. So in the spirit of keeping in touch, for those of you who have follow-up questions or comments on land use impacts related to this service plan, please contact me at my email address here, or if you have specific questions on the actual service plan itself, general questions, please contact Janice, indicated here with her email. So with that, again, we thank you for joining us in this conversation. We hope to stay in touch with you, and thank you VTA staff also for coordinating together to provide this conversation. With that, we'll close up our webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.